So the 2022 Sanlam Gauge report has found businesses are not meeting the BBBEE scorecard targets, once again placing the spotlight on how to achieve transformation in the workplace. Sanlam Gauge co-founder Andile Khumalo joins me now to discuss this further. Mr. Khumalo, good morning and thank you very much for your time. It's clearly now evident there's a lot of work that still needs to be done insofar as transformation is concerned. Just take us through the report's findings.
Thank you very much for having us. So the report's findings are telling us that even with an increased sample, so last year we had about 3,000 companies form part of our sample. This year we are over 10,000 South African companies that have submitted valid BBBEE scorecards, and they've formed the total sample size that we've used. We've cut across all of the industries that have got their own sector codes, and that is about 10 actual sector codes and of course the generic code. And the highlights really are the fact that across all the sectors, none of the sectors, in terms of their own sector codes, have reached the targets they had set for themselves on BBBEE, other than for one element. So as you know, there are 5 elements to BEE. There's the ownership element, there is the management control element, there is the skills development element, there is the enterprise and supply development element, and then there is the socio-economic element, and that is the only element that's actually been met, which is the final one around socio-economic development and doing things for the less fortunate in your particular industry. On all the other 4, not a single one of them has reached its targets. And in fact, management control seems to be the one lagging most behind.
Perhaps before we get to what really needs to be done now, talk to me about what we can attribute the exceedingly well results on the socio-economic development of companies. What exactly is this? Is it just because it's so easy they can throw money at projects?
So typically it's very low in terms of its weighting. So in many of these sector codes, it weighs around 5, anything between 5 and 7 points in a scorecard. So it's in actual importance in terms of weighting on a total scorecard is not very high. But as a standalone, it's relatively easy to comply with because many South African companies, by just their very nature, have always found something to do around supporting those less fortunate in their communities. There's also a lot of regulation in many companies around that. If you look at the financial services sector, there's a lot of talk around, banking the unbanked and doing a lot for socio-economic development. If you look at mining companies, in terms of the laws in mining, there are very clear requirements around community development. And most companies typically do their bit when it comes to bursaries or when it comes to clinics and schools and any kind of support in society and in communities. So that is something that companies have always done. With or without BE, companies have always done something for the less fortunate. And I guess to a large extent, that's why it's relatively easier. If you look at the other elements, though, the story is quite different.
Now, let's talk about the other elements, because honestly speaking, when we speak of BBBEE, it's very important, particularly for ensuring we have or we address the inequality challenge as well as unemployment. But it seems now many are even throwing in the towel. We've had even ministers that have criticized or spoken of the failures of BBBEE. So what exactly needs to happen? Because I know you're of the view that we cannot just do away with it. We need to transform the economy.
I'm absolutely of the view. I cannot think of a more important piece of policy than broad-based Black economic empowerment to try and undo, or at least to some extent try and reverse what has been systematic exclusion of Black people in the economy and therefore in the livelihoods that Black people live. So the fact that we have not met the targets is not in itself a reason to then scrap it. I think there are many challenges with BBBEE. And I think for me, if you ask me what I think is the overarching challenge, it is the lack of commitment. By nature, a business will do that which it is required almost to a bare minimum. So that is why you often find that, whatever the requirement is, companies just tend to meet it. Nobody goes out there and says, you know what, you want 26% or 25% BE shareholding, I'm going to go and blow the lights out and make it 40, 50, 60, 70. Companies typically do the minimum that they're required to do because they see BBBEE as just another piece of regulation. They don't quite see it as a systematic policy to try and normalize the society we live in after, of course, decades and centuries of ostracization of Black people. So I think it's the mindset that we see BE through. One of our panelists at the launch said something like, the generic scorecard should be about compliance, ticking the boxes, but sector codes and sector charters must be about transformation. In other words, trying to beat the bare minimum that's sitting in a generic scorecard. And I think the ultimate issue is that business doesn't quite see transformation as that. They see it as a law, they see it as something to comply with, and as long as I hit my bare minimums, I'm fine. So if I'm level 1, if I'm level 3, whatever it is that I think is a bare minimum, I'm going to hit that and I'm going to be okay. They don't quite see it as something that transforms society.
And I'm sure they're going to find it difficult, or it's going to be difficult to change their mindset. But insofar as window dressing or fronting is concerned, is it still very prevalent? Or now, because many are not meeting the standards, they're just doing the bare minimum, then it really is legitimate though? That is the level that they have scored and that's it? Or you're seeing a lot of fronting and window dressing still to this day?
I think the BEE Commissioner's office wouldn't be around if fronting was no longer an issue. So we have a BEE Commissioner whose job it is, frankly, to police fronting. And she in her office still deal with a lot of fronting cases. And a lot of it is around structures. I think the basic BEE fronting has been kind of found out, and those who still try it probably are operating under the radar. But to the extent that your transaction is more than 25 million and you are reporting to the BEE Commissioner, it'll be found out quite quickly if you are fronting with your domestic helper or with your gardener, what people used to do a few years ago. I'm not saying it's not happening, but I think it's a lot harder now to try and get away with those kind of things. I think what you are seeing, though, is that there's a lot of transactions and structuring where companies announce a PE deal, and essentially it's the left pocket doing a deal with the right pocket, right? So there's no real identifiable black shareholders that are actually economically empowered. I read a report the other day from the banking sector that talked about how the voting rights targets for banks, now we're just talking banks, not financial services, but just banks specifically, how their voting targets in terms of equity shareholding has been reached, but their economic interest target has not been reached. And that tells you that, you've got BE structures where there are shareholders, right, who've got voting rights, but those shares that have voting rights don't have economic rights. And for me, at the end of the day, you shouldn't be splitting those two things. If you're really empowering somebody, you're saying they have a say in the operations of the business, or at least the strategic direction, but they're also there on the table to receive dividends and capital growth.
No, we must certainly have a long way to go. Mr. Khumalo, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's Sanlam Gauge Report co-founder Andile Khumalo.